In 1818, 42 years after the shot heard around the world cracked across a Massachusetts field, John Adams was asked to reflect on the meaning and impact of the American Revolution. In this brief letter, Adams explained that the American Revolution was not a common event. Its effects and consequences have already been over a great part of the globe. And when and where are they to cease? But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. Revolutionary thought and thinking did not end with the Treaty of Paris, nor did it begin at Lexington and Concord. In this special podcast series, we'll explore the revolutionary ideas that were catalyzed and accelerated by the self-evident idea that all men are created equal, and what bold and new thinking that declaration is forged. Revolution at 250 is a special production of PreserveCast in partnership with Preservation Maryland and the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Our hosts are Katie Caljean, President and CEO of the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and Nicholas Redding, host of PreserveCast and President and CEO of Preservation Maryland.
This is Nick Redding, and you are listening to another episode of Revolution at 250. This is a place where we, along with our friends at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, are exploring how revolutionary ideas shaped life in Maryland and how those ideas continue to spark long after independence. Today's episode is going to be focusing in on the free press and how ideas around free expression and freedom of speech impacted generations of Marylanders. We'll explore how this core value of the revolutionary generation was embraced by Black Marylanders and the legacy of the Baltimore Afro-American, the longest-running African-American family-owned newspaper in the United States, which was established back in 1892. Joining us today to discuss all of this is Savannah Wood, an artist with deep roots in both Baltimore and Los Angeles. As the executive director of Afro Charities, Wood is leading the charge to increase access to the 130-year-old Afro-American newspaper's extensive archives. And in this role, she's shepherded the organization through a period of dramatic and historic growth, initiated new programming, and attracted support from national funders, including the Mellon Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and the Ruth Foundation. In this conversation, what we're hoping to accomplish is to explore how that landscape of a free press here in Maryland and beyond evolved, the challenges faced by the founders of the Baltimore Afro-American, and how the revolutionary concept of free speech was utilized by Black Americans to advocate, develop community, and document their experience in newspapers in Baltimore and beyond. Savannah, you are the perfect guest for this conversation. So pleased to have you. Thanks again for joining us. To start off, can you tell us a little bit about your role at Afro Charities and what brought you to this position?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me first. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I started at Afro Charities in 2019. I had been working in arts and culture organizations in both Chicago and Los Angeles that were investigating archives for some reason. They were all interested in archives. And so my introduction to archiving was actually through the arts. First at the Astor Gates Studio and Rebuild Foundation in Chicago, and then at an organization called Clock Shop in Los Angeles, where we were exploring the archives of the science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler in a year-long celebration of her life. So through those interests, I started thinking about the Afro, which is my family's business in Baltimore, and wondering what kind of archives we might have. And so with that curiosity, with the curious spirit of an artist, I came back to Baltimore where I grew up and started poking around and seeing, well, what's going on here? Who's doing what with these collections? And what could we do? And so that was really my intro into Afro Charities. I came back and worked with actually the Afro News Company initially, but realized that Afro Charities already existed since 1963 as a nonprofit organization, primarily stewarding the Afro's charitable programs, Afro Clean Block and Mrs. Santa, 2 annual events. But I realized that we could do so much more by taking on care for the Afro archives and really trying to expand the reach of those collections so that everyday people, as well as scholars, could really access these collections that document so much of not only American history, but world history, and explicitly through a Black perspective.
That's a really great segue to thinking a little bit about the prevalence of newspapers, especially in the 1890s. Today, newspapers have so many challenges and are in a period of decline, and people read their news on their phones. It's not as community driven as it once was. So in the 1890s, they were such a central part of our daily life. So what did the Afro provide to its community, and that was absent before its debut, and maybe thinking about into the current day, like in that moment prior to and leading up to today? How has Afro shaped its community?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is a completely different context. So, there was such a prevalence of newspapers, but as you mentioned, and Black newspapers in Maryland and elsewhere. There were so many at the time that the Afro started, but not all of them survived. And so I think part of what was different was that, and I don't know completely, but I'm going to make a couple leaps here. But I would imagine that the Afro was maybe more embedded into its community and therefore had more community support. When it was founded, it was actually founded by a man named William Alexander, who was a reverend, and he started the paper as the Home Protector. And I think it was back in 1889. And then by 1892, they had changed the name to the Afro-American. My understanding is that my great-great-grandfather was involved in the printing of the paper from the very beginning, but they didn't come to own it until 1897. And that's when our family kind of took off with it. But my great-great-grandfather, John H. Murphy Sr., was publishing his own paper called the Sunday School Helper at the time, which was basically organizing the church's Sunday schools in this newspaper so that there was community news going out in that paper. So I think they had really strong ties to these institutions that formed the basis for Black political culture and power in Baltimore. The church, of course, the newspaper is another one that they probably just had really great connections with folks, and they were providing news about things that people were interested in. I guess other papers probably did that to a degree, but the relationships do matter. And so I think that's kind of been at the core of the Afro from the beginning, is these relationships with community members, supporting the wider community, and covering news that they're interested in. So always having it be a bit of a two-way street, where not only are you putting information out, but you're asking people to reflect back in the paper as well.
And there's also like a scalar nature to that too, right? Like the immediate community, what's happening day to day within your church or within your community group. But then like also thinking about on the global scale, you mentioned more national stories. Can you give some examples of some national stories that you can find reading the in the archives?
Yeah, one of the things that we read about often when looking back in the archives for the Afro is that it started as a 4-page paper, and then it took some time to ramp up, to expand to an empire, essentially, primarily in the mid-20th century. But national stories, there's so many, and from so many different angles. If you think about going to the March on Washington, for instance, national story, and they're covering the fashion, they're covering the routes to get there, they're covering somebody who is roller skating from Chicago to DC to be there, and he's on the front page saying, I'm roller skating to DC. So it's really the breadth of coverage also super important for maintaining readership and having so many different ways for people to engage with these things. They covered the bombings in Tulsa. That massacre was covered in the Afro. They covered international stories. In the 1930s, Langston Hughes actually wrote for the Afro, documenting the Spanish Civil War. Mm-hmm. So there's so much that's in the collection that's really unique. And it comes back to these relationships because Black Americans had been isolated from broader culture for so long. There were just such tight-knit relationships between people across class often, but you can have a Langston Hughes writing for the paper. You could have a Romeo Bearden who's, providing political cartoons in the paper, and all that was happening concurrently. And it provided just a broader coverage that interested lots of different types of people.
So, Savannah, I think one of the things that's so interesting about this, and you were talking about sort of this landscape of Black journalism, that the Afro is certainly not alone, but, it's sort of it has lasted, it has persisted, and it has this amazing legacy with it. One of the things that we're talking about here in this sort of like special podcast series is how the thought and theory of the revolutionary generation reverberated for generations beyond, and the right to a free press, free expression, it's enshrined in the Constitution's Bill of Rights. It's a direct outcome of the revolution. Did that always extend to Black Americans? Was it a right that required defense at institutions like the Afro? Like, how free was the free Black press in Jim Crow 19th century America?
Well, we can look to history and just see all of the violence that's been committed against Black Americans, and that is your answer. There were certainly presses that were targeted specifically for their coverage violently by killing people who were writing in opposition to the dominant narrative. So yes, there's always been opposition from the beginning, which is part of why it's such a brave pursuit at that era, at that time, to have a press with a physical location also that people could come to, and they knew where it was. So yeah, it's had to be fought for and defended tooth and nail. And you have a responsibility to cover the issues that your readership cares about from a perspective that resonates with theirs and that tells the truth. One of the things that's so important about the Black press as an institution in the US is that it's covering things from the angle of the oppressed. And so you're hearing the stories from a completely different perspective, which is some of the work that we do also at Afro Charities when we're working with young people, for instance, is we'll look at an event in history and we'll look at it from the Baltimore Sun's angle and we'll look at it from the Baltimore Afro's angle and do, a comparative read. What's the difference between these two articles? How is this writer writing about this? What do they care about? What are like the top line stories that are coming out of here? How does the Afro look at it? What's the bias there? Because I'm not saying it's without bias. I'm just saying that there is a different perspective. But I think that the mainstream press would purport to be unbiased, and the Black press explicitly states that they're writing from a perspective of Black people to advance our rights in the country.
I think that's interesting. You touched on the bias piece too. Like, I think a lot of people were surprised when they learned that like the 19th century press, going back to like the Civil War and pre-Civil War era, was like outwardly biased. Like they just kind of told you what their bias was, which was sort of a different way of doing it than we do now. Was the Afro? Did they ever have like a political bias, or was it sort of always an unbiased? Like, did they?
I would say it's definitely biased, absolutely biased, and explicit about it. But it's, and it was it's necessary.
I was just curious. I think people would be interested in that and hearing that piece.
Well, I think, the Afro really emerges out of this longstanding tradition of the Black press. So the first Black newspaper is Freedom's Journal. And as we're talking about anniversaries, 2027 is the 200th anniversary of the Black press. So for just 51 years shy of what the United States is, the Black press has been in existence, documenting from a counter perspective. And in the Freedom's Journal, their first editorial, basically, the first lines, they say, "We wish to plead our own cause. For far too long, others have spoken for us." So it is explicit in that statement what their intent is. Other people have been speaking for us for too long. They're putting out these pieces that are biased against us, that are dehumanizing towards us. And so we're going to plead our own cause. That's why the Black press exists, so that you can get those stories from the inside rather than having them reflected to you in a distorted lens that is clearly racist, clearly biased, and clearly meant to keep you disenfranchised.
What do you think in terms of where the Afro was located? Do you think that Baltimore, the backdrop of Baltimore, plays into the story?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Baltimore is such a unique place. And having lived in a lot of other places, every time I'm here, I'm just like, oh, okay. it's a little different.
That's an interesting perspective too, because you spend so much time on the West Coast. So I'm curious your take on, just the social landscape and why the Afro was able to persist and be such a strong voice against the backdrop of Baltimore.
I really hate that I don't know where I got this from. And maybe you can help me with this, but my understanding is that Baltimore had the largest population of free Black people before the Civil War.
That is correct.
And I don't know I don't know who to cite for that little nugget. And I wish I did, because learning that in my 30s really changed my perspective on the city. And I was astounded that I had never learned that in school, because it's a fascinating statistic. I think it also just shapes the way that we understand freedom and the pushback to freedom in Baltimore as well. I loved reading Martha Jones's book, Birthright Citizens, for instance. There's so much of that is based in this city and about how Baltimore has always been on the forefront of defining what citizenship is, particularly as it relates to Black people, specifically because of our history with freedom in this city. So I think certainly there's a way in which, we're mid-Atlantic, we're North and South, we're a border state. There's all of these very dynamic things that are happening within Baltimore and more largely in Maryland that make it unique. Just unique. In the types of enslavement that happened in Maryland, there was so much happening here, like people building ships, there's industrial things that are happening, there's agricultural things that are happening. So there's just so many different types of experiences happening within one place that makes a fascinating backdrop for understanding the rest of the country also, and for having a potential audience for the Afro that, maybe there's, I don't know this, but maybe there's more literacy here because there's more freedom. Maybe there's more economic opportunity because there's more freedom. Maybe there's just a different way that you could imagine yourself because you've seen more freedom. I don't know, but I can hazard a guess. And I would imagine that, yes, definitely this place has had a huge impact on what the Afro is and what it imagined itself to be on a national scale.
Yeah, and I think the adjacency to Washington, D.C. too,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
So many national moments happening in our nation, in the Capitol, and being an outpost, and in reaction to larger moments that are happening on the federal level that Baltimore is in response to.
Absolutely. And in that proximity provides a bit of access also to, a national conversation. Right. For sure. Yeah, and the Afro had outposts in D.C. So the Baltimore Afro is where it was founded, but the Afro also had offices in Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Newark, and then published national papers as well. So they had 13 different editions at their height, which is fascinating to think about. So there were, there was like the Red Star, the Blue Star would go out on certain days, Yeah.
Wow. That is, that alone is a really I know that the era of newspapers, they were really something else, but that really kind of puts it in perspective. And it's kind of a good segue, honestly, to like what I wanted to ask you about, which is, one of the reasons, kind of going back to this concept of like how the revolution reverberates, and how different aspects of American life pick up on these revolutionary ideas. One of the reasons, that the founding generation is so adamant that the right to a free press has to be protected is that they feel that it would act as a check on government. It's been referred to as like the fourth branch. So, obviously the Afro played a tremendous role in this during its long history. Was that talk to us about like the thought process of the leadership of the Afro and what you can see in the archives in terms of their recognition of that responsibility to be that voice during those critical moments. I mean, you've touched on some of them, but it sounds like this was a very, this was a decision that they made with a lot of thought and care to be that voice, particularly as they expanded across the country.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I really do always come back to Freedom's Journal as like setting the tone for the Black press and directly connecting the Afro to that legacy of advocacy. And so we see this time and time again that the Afro is advertising, organizing campaigns for equal access to everything, like really pushing this desegregation agenda, essentially. Big backers of the NAACP. Carl Murphy, who is the second publisher of the paper, was partially responsible for Thurgood Marshall getting into law school. They remain close. There's an audio recording of the two of them talking about Brown versus Board in the collection. They're documenting every single thing that's coming out about desegregation and pushing that agenda forward, and putting provocative articles in the paper that are meant to get Baltimore citizens inflamed. And organized and thinking about, that's right. I do pay taxes. Why can't I access this? When they built this other pool, is it actually equal? Right. So the Afro really understood its place as a public forum. And it also participated in really interesting ways. So there is a certain level of showmanship that was happening too. There's a hysterical story in the Afro that is about desegregating Route 40. Mm-hmm. And basically this is around the time when African nations were gaining their independence. And so there's all of these new African dignitaries that are coming to the U.S. And effectively there's still segregation on Route 40, even in the 1960s, right? So they're coming to the U.S. and they're finding their way to Washington. And as they're driving through, they're trying to get served at restaurants and they're getting denied. And so this becomes a problem for the feds. Basically, the federal government is like, wait a minute, we can't be treating people like this. But the Afro dresses up one of their reporters as an African dignitary from a made-up country to see if they'll get served. And they document the whole thing. They send them out. Ultimately, like some places said they would serve them. Others said they wouldn't. They organized a whole group to come back to try again. It was just like the showmanship was on another level.
It feels like a reality TV show.
It does feel like a reality TV show, but it's like they had the freedom to play with stuff like that. Like, yes, we could do the hard hitting news and let's see what we can like test out for ourselves. We're going to do the inside scoop on this.
That's fascinating. One of the questions I have, though, too, is as you say, some of this was meant to inflame, and that's good advocacy. That's getting people aware of the condition and things like that. Do we have any sense for the readership? We've been talking a lot about like the publication and the people writing it. The readership, is it almost exclusively Black Baltimoreans or, Black citizens in the different communities that it's publishing? Do we know about like white readership of it? Were they reading this and how were they, there's obviously allies of the NAACP probably reading this so that they're aware of what's happening in these communities. But like, is the Baltimore Sun
any way to know, really.
Do we know?
There is some commentary, absolutely, from the Sun, and there's some like people writing in, and they'll publish letters to the editor from white readers who either have taken issue with something or support it. So yes, there's definitely some. I don't have a good sense of like numbers, what that would look like. I'm not sure that they documented it, but we also haven't processed the business papers yet, so we don't know. We don't know. There might be some stats in there that we're just unaware of at this moment.
Yeah, or subscriber lists, I guess.
Yeah.
Do those exist?
I don't know. So I have to tell you about the archives because
that's probably a good. Yeah. I don't know, Katie,
curious. I do, right? Because, archives are only as good as like what's available to be able to find, but also the questions you want to ask, right? Like I joke, we like at MCHC, we ask our collections questions. It's like, we can answer that. There's evidence. Like we could form an opinion on this because we have primary sources. So I'm so curious about all of the I know there's an amazing photo archive, but I'm sure there's so much more that you're excited to share.
Well, I'm happy to share it with you. The collections it's massive. You have to imagine it's like basically all of these documents collected over time during the publication of this newspaper for the past 133, nearly 134 years.
Right.
So it's obviously not everything is included in that, but a huge amount is. And so they referred to what we're calling like the Afro morgue files. It was the morgue is the terminology that's used in newspapers. So it's like clippings from the newspaper. There's photographs that they used to print the actual images in the newspaper. There's sometimes the metal cuts that were created in-house because all of this production was happening in-house in Baltimore to physically print images in the newspaper. So there's so much. There's reporters' notebooks. There's like pamphlets from events that have, that are annotated. There's 3 million images is what we're estimating. And then on the backs of those images are usually the captions that also ran alongside them. And everything is in a subject file that is somewhat alphabetical, but not really. So if it's basically a person, it's a noun is what would be on there. So it's like somebody's
very
name,
subjective.
an organization's name, an event, there's folders just called riots. There's several of those folders. And then what we're doing right now as a team is we have right now 3 full-time people working on processing the Afro morgue files, which are basically all of those things that I described. We estimate it's about 1,400 linear feet. So it's a huge collection. And they're basically rearranging all of these files so that they're actually in alphabetical order, making sure that the housing that the materials are in is adequate for the material that's there, removing those metal cuts because they are sharp edged so they can damage the paper that's in there. They don't have a lot of research value also because we typically have the silver gelatin photograph that correlates to it. We're keeping the cuts, much to their chagrin, but I'm an artist and I think they're beautiful.
I would say that's a really cool installation of some sort.
We got to do something with these. So we'll have something going with that. But that's just the Afro morgue file. So then on top of that, there are family papers that we haven't even surveyed yet. So we're trying to get some funding right now to do that work and to continue the processing work. On top of that, there are business records that, again, we haven't even surveyed yet. So we don't really know everything that's in there. We don't know if we have those distribution lists. We might. I've seen some stuff in there just on a cursory glance, but we haven't had a chance to do a deep dive. And then on top of that, there's more. There's physical objects. There's bound volumes of past issues of the newspaper. So they would take a January through December or a January through June of each edition and bind them into a big book. And we don't have all of them, but we have a lot. That's a lot of those. So the collection's massive, and it really has been used internally. And so now what we're working to do is to turn it from an internal repository into a public-facing archive, which is a huge undertaking. And this will live at our new research center that we're building that's going to open to the public next year.
Are there any other corollaries to this type of project in the nation, in the world? I just feel like it's so unique because you're taking something that was meant to be like institutional archives and you're creating public access, which is amazing. And the research potential for all sorts of different topics is this is global, right? Like this is huge. So I'm curious if there's like anybody out there that you're admiring, or like, striving to, but it's so unique. Like I can't think of another example.
It feels like that sometimes where it's just like, because we have to describe it to other people, like just the size of it is hard for people to wrap their heads around, and that it would all be from one organization.
Right.
But there's a great project happening right now with the Johnson Publishing Company archives. So Ebony and Jet.
Great.
Several years ago, a group of foundations came together to purchase that archive, and now it's being similarly processed. So it's fascinating because it's happening right in tandem. It's like happening right at the same time, which is so awesome. But the main difference between the Johnson Publishing Company collections and ours is just that ours extends back an additional 50 years.
Right.
So so there's a greater depth of history that's covered there. But then on their end, they have more color photographs, and it's like more celebrities because it was a magazine, several magazines as opposed to a newspaper. And so, the images are a little sexier, in my opinion. And the coverage is still great. They have great writers for Johnson Publishing Company too. So I think there's going to be a lot of overlap in subject matter. And I'm really interested in that too. Like once we both have public finding aids available where we might have had reporters at the same events and seeing then like, how did they cover this from different perspectives? That'll be really interesting.
Corroborating stories. Yeah.
It'll be fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a bunch of follow-ups based on some of the great content you're giving us here and the amazing answers. One of which is you're talking about this huge collection, this amazing collection. Sometimes as like a historian, you're reading stuff and you're like, I wish this person had written this down, or I wish this person had saved this, or, you read something and they're like, their papers were lost. And so you just don't even have anything on significant individuals. In this case, it's the complete opposite. Why is that? Was there a sense at the time that like, this is very important? Were they just a collecting family? Like, some people come from families who are like, oh, my grandma won't throw anything away, that kind of thing. Or like, were they just really good at this? Did they have a sense of this is historical? Because not every newspaper has what you're describing.
Yeah, I think it was pretty common practice for newspapers to maintain their own, they would call it either a morgue or a library. So they would maintain that primarily because they wanted to refer back to their own work. Mm-hmm. So, you already got a photo from someone. If you're going to do a follow-up story on them, you don't necessarily want to have to reach out, wait for them to send it. You have to imagine the time that they're in also, and that there's no internet, there's no email, there's maybe you have an encyclopedia you're referencing, an almanac, so you're keeping all of these reports in your own internal library so that you have a reference. Right. Or if you plan to do a follow-up on somebody, you want to know that, okay, we have all of these documents from when they first started in this role. Let's see what we wrote about them 10 years ago and how we might update that. So that it was sort of common practice for newspapers to keep those things. Over time, I think a lot of newspapers got rid of that stuff, which is, it hurts my heart sometimes, and some of them gave it to historical societies in their cities and things like that, history museums, which is great. For us, I think because the Afro has always been independent, that's always been a very important part of the business's identity. And they've always known, like at a certain point, they did know, oh, this is a treasure trove. So that dates back, as far as I can tell, at least to the 80s. Okay. So when I moved back here, I had no concept of this, but apparently in the late 80s, there was some work happening. There was a lot of transition happening at the Afro. They were moving from their longtime headquarters on North Ushaw Street, where they had been for 80 years. And in that process, they were uncovering all of this rich archival material that had been in the attic, in the basement, in, boxes. One box just was labeled, "Oh, wow."
I love that.
But I think that was when like the current publisher of the Afro was going through it with her cousins and was like, "Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, wow." And this just put it in a box and labeled it, "Oh, wow." Here are the standouts, because there wasn't a lot of organization around it. So it's gone through lots of things. And in the late 80s, they, solicited funding from the Ford Foundation, I think from the Mellon Foundation also. I don't know that they were so successful with that. They got some donations in, and there's a great video that we found and digitized from 1989 that's called Saving the Afro Archives. And it details that project. It shows the move happening. And it's basically the exact same project that I am doing now. I had no idea that this was, the blueprint for it. So it was an incredible confirmation to uncover this video and be like, okay, I'm not crazy. We just needed to wait for the right time when the conditions were right for us to make this happen. So their goal was to organize the collection, have a public research center. Their plan at the time was to have that research center on Morgan's campus. We're going to, of course, be in West Baltimore and have our new research center at Baltimore City's historic Upton Mansion, which we're renaming the Martha E. Murphy Research Institute, or MEMRI. And so, yeah, I mean, it's like, it's all coming to fruition. It just took like 40 years.
Yeah. Well,
Or
I mean,
100 and something, if you want to count. You know?
So, I mean, maybe that's a good segue because we have a listenership that's all across the country, so they might not be as familiar with the plans that you're describing. Obviously, you've painted the picture of, just this really important institution, and I think hopefully we've placed it in the context of sort of this revolutionary thought and free expression and the free press and how important the Black free press was. You obviously are archive, you've talked about the archives. Where are they going to land? What will the experience be like? What do you hope the experience will be like? And when might people be able to see some of that? And then maybe we can talk about how they can support it as well.
Great. First, I just want to say, like, the Black press is still here and is still powerful. Right. So I want to make sure that we talk about it in the present tense too, because it has been and it will be, and that requires support also. Mm-hmm. So subscribe to your local Black press and, donate if it's a nonprofit, or donate if it's a for-profit. Just help them out. It's a really hard landscape. There's so many newspapers that have shuttered, both, quote unquote, white and Black, all of that is really important. And we are building this public research center in a section of Baltimore that's called Old West Baltimore, is like the historic district. It's one of the largest nationally recognized Black historic districts in the country because it has so many fascinating, like, independent assets that contribute to this district. The building that we're rehabbing and adding to is also individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So it's listed as the Upton Mansion. It has served as a residence. It became the Baltimore Institute of Musical Arts. Oh, I'm sorry. Before that, it was WCAO, which was, I think, the second oldest radio station in Maryland. Then it became Baltimore Institute of Musical Arts, which was established specifically because Peabody would not admit Black students. So it was actually an integrated music school. And then once Peabody integrated, enrollment dropped at BIMA, and it became part of the Baltimore City public school system, which was its last use until 2006. So it's been vacant for about 20 years. It's in a part of Baltimore that has suffered from decades of disinvestment. So there's a lot of blight in the neighborhood. I believe the stat that I heard from the Upton Planning Committee, which is Upton is the smaller, neighborhood within Old West Baltimore where we are. I think they said it was 1 in 3 homes, maybe 1 in 4 is vacant in that area. So it's a huge amount of vacancy. And so what we're doing is we're investing $16.5 million into this 1-acre site to restore the historic mansion and to create an addition at the rear of it to basically have a campus that's dedicated to the Afro archives. And so researchers, through the processing work that we're doing, we're developing a finding aid that you can find online. I believe it's afrocharities.libraryhost.com is where we have that set up. And we're adding to that as we move through this processing project. So whatever's processed, we intend to have available for researchers to use once we open, which is why it's so critical that we finish this processing work that is highly detailed and very labor intensive and very expensive because it's labor intensive. But we're working through it because we think it's just really important for people to have access to these files. So we're starting with the Afro morgue files that I described earlier. And we'll then move on, hopefully with funding, to the family papers and the business papers as well. The Afro News Company will have offices on site. Afro Charities offices will be on site. We will host community events there. Afro Charities has a biannual artist commissioning project that we do that's very closely inspired by my work at Clock Shop in Los Angeles with our Octavia Butler project. And we will have exhibitions on site. There's just a wealth of things that will happen there. So our goal is to really bring back the media use of that building, the artistic use of that building, and the educational use of that building. And so that's what our project does on that site. And yeah, we're still working out all the operational details, but the goal is basically people will make an appointment to view materials. We'll pull it for them, bring it to them in the reading room. And that's that.
It's got to be one of the most exciting archival and history projects happening, certainly right now, but perhaps ever in the city of Baltimore and in the state of Maryland. I mean, it is peerless. I think a lot of people listening are probably thinking, well, how can I help? So how can they help? I mean, and you made a great point, and I didn't mean to say that the Black Press doesn't still exist. It obviously still exists, and I want to make sure that I clear that part up. But I was just sort of referencing the history. But yeah. But a lot of people listening want to know how they can help in this particular effort. So what are ways to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits that we'll have once we're on site at our own location is being able to dictate who can come in and the hours. And so I anticipate that we'll likely have more opportunities for volunteers to help with some of the work that we're doing across the board. So stay tuned for that. I don't have any hard answers for that right now. And of course, the obvious thing is to donate to Afro Charities, because as I mentioned, like, this processing project is really people powered. And it's really important to us to be able to provide a living wage to our team. Archival work is also so often itinerant, where people are hired for a 1-year, 2-year contract with no job security after going through rigorous training to get certifications to be able to do this work. And so it's a huge disparity that I'm very uncomfortable with. And so my goal as a leader of this organization is to really care for our team and to make sure that they're, earning a living wage, and that they have some health benefits and a little bit of work-life balance. And so donations help us to make that possible. I think this episode's going to come out in May. So I'll also plug that Afro Charities is hosting our annual fundraiser on June 6th, 2026 at CC's Roland Park. It'll be a really fun celebratory afternoon, which I love, because then you can go home afterwards and do whatever you want. And you don't have to wear a ball gown if you don't want to. It's cocktail attire. And I think the URL for that is eventbrite.afrocharities.com. It might be afrocharities.eventbrite.com. Either way, you can find it.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes so people can just click on it. They don't even have to search for it. Because we definitely want to support the work that's going on there.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating, it's inspiring, it's exciting, it's important. I think, Katie, we've since we're talking about this in 2026, I wanted to see if we could end the conversation on a question about the sesquicentennial. And, obviously we've got two dual milestones happening here, where you're going to be, moving into this new space, but it's also the 250th anniversary of American independence. And so there's all these milestones happening, a lot of different ways that we could look at that. I'm curious how historically the Afro covered these milestones that happened during its period. It's obviously still in operation, but in its historical period of operation, 2026 was the 150th of the country. 1976 is the 200th. So it was around during both of those as well. How did it cover those? How is it covering this current one? What's the landscape of commemorations and anniversaries look like for the Afro?
It's obviously very complicated, right?
Sure.
In some of the historic images that I've seen inside the Afro offices, Frederick Douglass is on the wall. There's a photograph of him on the wall, big and prominent in the office. And of course, he has his famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," which is a scathing critique of this celebration, which is so important that we highlight that and talk about that. So when we look back historically in 1920s, I did a little look right before we got on here because I wanted to know as well. In 1926, there was, I believe it was 1926, there was mention of the sesquicentennial providing jobs for Negroes. So that's what they were focused on, is that there were more jobs available because there were all these celebrations happening and they needed labor and they needed opportunity to work. So it wasn't about celebrating the anniversary so much as it was the practical things that were coming out of that celebration for Black people. So again, this shows in so many ways the different perspective of the Black press and what their interests are. And for 1976, there was a revisit to Frederick Douglass, and specifically calling that out, that where are we in our rights as citizens? Have we made it to where we said we wanted to be? So those are the types of questions that the Afro was covering then. And I'm not sure what they have planned. Of course, like Afro Charities and Afro News work together often, but we're two separate organizations. So
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not sure what they have planned for a commemoration this year. But I would hazard to guess that they're probably planning more for the 200th anniversary of the Black press than for the 250th anniversary of America's independence.
Well, what would your hope be for 2026? There's still time in the year.
There is still time. I mean, it's just such a complicated relationship for us, you know? So I would hope that we have enough space to have those nuanced conversations. So I'm glad that we're doing this right now. And we already know what it's going to look like from an official national standpoint.
Yes. But we're in Maryland.
I know, but I'm just like, ugh. So as much as we can do to kind of counter that one note patriotism and bring up the volume on the many voices that make America what it is, I think that's the route that people should be taking. And that there would be space for critique, space for other important anniversaries to be mentioned within this context, and to really, contextualize what it means to be 250 years in now.
I think
however you see fit.
Yeah, no, I think
answer. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to kind of put a cap on the conversation and a hopeful look at the future. You know, that it's important to have those nuanced conversations. It's important to understand the challenges, because that makes the success all that much more special, to understand how difficult it was to achieve. It's been just a pleasure. I mean, I think most people coming away from this are going to want to dig into all the resources that you have online, which are significant. We'll put a link to those in the show notes. We'll put a link to the event that you have coming up for those local listeners. I know I was trying to check my calendar while we were talking so that I can try and make it. But Savannah, this has been a pleasure. And on behalf of everybody here in Maryland, thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy talking with you today.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.